Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal employee and proud of it. Today I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court ruling, but first I'm going to talk just in general about the power of government. Of course, I am a Fed, so I'm both part of the government, and I also know a little bit about what the government can do and how powerful the government is. And I'm going to point to my background today. As you know, I've been working on trying to get live internet onto my background, and I've been tremendously successful thanks to the staff over here, and I got to really appreciate what they do. And this is actually Zillow behind you, but what Zillow is an actual satellite picture of the Earth. It's not today. I don't know what day it is, and I don't know what exactly the image is from. And of course, the image is pieced together from different places and different days with no cloud cover on it, or else some way of getting through the cloud cover. But the fact of the matter is that this satellite technology and satellite imaging is a federal initiative. It's been worked on for years. They've had secret satellites up there since the 60s and 70s. And the other satellites went up and are now being sold to various companies. And of course, Zillow is one that buys satellite images and joins those satellite images with data mining of real estate data. But there are companies out there that mine data for financial data, or for marketing data, or for personal information, medical information of people, and all of those are available. And if they're available to private parties, they're doubly available to the government. And I've been very concerned because for the first time in our history, or the second time, I guess, if we count Nixon, the federal government, and in the Bush administration in particular, have determined that they've been authorized to practically do anything domestically in order to fight terrorism. And authorized by what? Authorized by the War Powers, Congressional War Powers Act, right after 9/11, that said that the executive had the right to go to war against Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda organization. So what kind of things have they determined that they can do? Well, among them was the wiretap problem that we've had, where not only have individuals in America had electronic surveillance without a FISA court approval. Now, the FISA court approval, they've said, well, it's hard to do and take some paperwork. And Congress has been willing to update that and make it easier. But instead, the federal government asserted that they had the right to, under the War Powers Act and under the act where Congress approved the war, to overcome the FISA Act. FISA is the Federal Intelligent, I'm not sure what FISA stands for, but it's the secret court that allows wiretapping in classified instances. And this was passed after Watergate and after a lot of surveillance against President Nixon's domestic enemies. And of course, that was after a lot of surveillance against whoever J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI wanted to surveil. So that's been limited, and basically you have to go to a special secret court and get a warrant, and once you get a warrant, then you can wiretap or listen in electronically to whoever you want. Then another program came up. There was some controversy over whether that was legal or not, whether you could do it with citizens or only foreigners, and basically a lot of people thought, gee, this is overreaching. There was a FISA court for a reason, even though most politicians, absolutely 100%, Democratic or Republican, support wiretapping terrorists, find out what they're up to. They don't necessarily support not going through the courts. So what the Bush administration was saying, this is especially Mr. Gonzalez, was that giving the executive the right to make war on terrorists gave them the right to bypass the courts, to not have to go back to Congress for anything, basically. And what does anything include? Now, there's another very, very controversial release of data, classified data, that the Bush administration was working with SWIFT. SWIFT is the International Wire Transfer Organization, and getting data on wire transfers. I personally don't have a problem with that. However, if you're going to get citizens' data, you should get a warrant for it. Private courts, or in other words, criminal courts, do require you to get a warrant if you're going to do a data search. Now, I do remember interview with Mr. Levy. Stuart Levy was the head of that program for the Treasury Department, and he basically said, well, there's only been one instance where somebody's got out of line and asked for data that he wasn't supposed to. He didn't say what the instance was, whether the guy was checking up on his ex-girlfriend or something like that, or what exactly happened. But there's certainly room for problems as far as that's concerned. And of course, anybody who's watched a movie called Enemy of the State knows that satellites overhead can go beam in on where you are and follow your car and so on and so forth. So what can satellites do? Well, first of all, there's two kinds of satellites. One is geosynchronous and stays over the same spot on the Earth all the time. And it has to be sent off a certain amount of speed and momentum in order to exactly hit this geosynchronous spot. It's about 23,000 miles above the Earth's surface that stays just exactly in the same place. The other kind are these little mini satellites. The mini satellites go much closer, are much faster. They whiz around the Earth. They have the equivalent of cell phone tower equipment in it, so that every time the satellite, there's 20 or 30 of these little satellites whizzing around. Every time the satellite gets out of range, it automatically switches, like a cell phone switches from one cell phone tower to another as you drive along, to another tower, another satellite that takes over the signal and keeps it going. So there's a number of different satellites, and there's a number of different countries that have them. Now, what I'm going to do over here, and this is pretty new for me, I'm going to look away. I'm going to get on the internet over here, and I'm going to focus in. And right now, we're going to look at Washington, D.C. And we can see Washington, D.C., and that's the loop over there, appearing before us. And that's pretty amazing. I mean, so what? Everybody's seen it a million times, but now here it is behind me on TV. Let's go a little further and go up to the city level. Okay, there's I-95. I hope that's Washington. It could be Baltimore. And there's an actual urban area over there. And I'm going to focus in a little bit more. And what I'm going to try to do is bring it up to the point where it actually looks into somebody's backyard. And let's see if you can see their car. Okay, I have streets over here. Seems to be a big area. Okay, let's bring it up all the way to the homes level. Okay, this appears to be Baltimore, and looks like I went a little too far. Oh, it's on streets. I want to keep it on satellite. There we go. All right, let's go in and take a look. If you go too close in this particular program, you actually get to the streets. And I don't want streets. All right, that looks about as close as I'm going to get. And as you see, I seem to be in a neighborhood over here. Oh, okay, these are just apartments. Let's see if I can actually find something worth seeing. Ah, here we go. Here's a parking lot. Okay, let's see if it let me go in, drill in a little further. Ah, darn it. Come on. Okay, I'm going to have to come up. It's only doing the homes level. But anyway, as you can see over here, and here I just happen to be on a website that's called Zillow, and I'm going to see if I can get my mouse in here. You can actually see on this website individual trucks in a parking lot. So this is for public use. You can imagine what the real good satellites can do, and you can imagine what it can see and who is there. Now, is there a satellite overhead watching you every second? Absolutely not. You're not worth it. And that's one of the great things about government surveillance, is that most people are just not that darn important. We think we are, we hope we are, we fear that we are, but we are just not important enough to surveil. However, if this is actually out on public internet over here, and I have another program called Google Earth, which represents, I think, views from 2 or 3 months ago, and it can get right down on your house, and it can show your car in your parking lot. You can actually see what kind of car it is. So if that car happens to not belong to you or your wife, but to your girlfriend, they can certainly put 2 and 2 together. Will they? Will anybody bother? Is it so important to anybody to do that? Real-time satellite time costs a lot, and of course this isn't real-time. This particular program called Zillow is just to look at houses and see what the real estate value is, which of course is pretty intrusive right there, because you can click on anybody's house, tells you how many bedrooms there are, how many bathrooms, what the square footage is, when did you buy it, is it on the market? All this is public information, but up to now, not that easy to find in one place at one time. So what did the Supreme Court do? What the Supreme Court did is one of the assertions that the president made after 9/11 and after we went into Afghanistan, the first set of battles, was that the people that were caught, that were associated with Al-Qaeda, were not prisoners of war. They didn't come under the Geneva Conventions. What do the Geneva Conventions say? They say a lot, but one of the Geneva Conventions says, basically, you have to treat any detainee in a conflict humanely. And on top of that, if you do try him, you can only try him in a constituted court of law, and only under circumstances which require due process and other things. Obviously, some countries like Somalia can't do that. Other countries like Iraq hack people's heads off. So obviously not everybody is following this law, but we are, America, we're supposed to be better than that. So this assertion that was made, that just the fact that Congress approved the executive branch to go to war gave them the right to declare detainees as non-combatant hostiles, there's a word for it, I don't happen to have it in front of me, that's a big question over there. And how they're treated. Are you allowed to waterboard them? Are you allowed to torture them? If there's information that would save lives, are you allowed to torture them? And the answer kind of came up, no. And how did that answer come up? Well, there's a number of questions that were decided by the courts and by the Congress. Now, one of the questions was on torture. There was a congressional resolution, I think about a year ago, that was pushed by John McCain, that was virtually unanimous, that said, no matter what the Bush administration says, still under Congress, and it still has to carry out laws passed by Congress, and you can't mistreat enemy combatants. Enemy combatants was the word. You can't torture them. and there has to be rules around it. And of course, that was in reaction to the whole Abu Ghraib situation. So in that case, what was this about? Now, this was yet another case. This is the fourth or fifth case that's gone to the Supreme Court. In this particular case, it was determined that the military tribunals, which were set up in the wake of 9/11, and that were set up without a law from Congress, without approval of the federal courts, that basically, as long as they took these combatants and they kept them outside of the United States, that the federal courts could not even intervene and could not even determine how they would be treated. And that was thrown out. There's been 4 cases over here. One of the cases is Yasser Hamdi, and the Supreme Court ruled 8-1. That includes 2, or at least at that time, 1 member that was appointed by Bush himself, that Mr. Hamdi was deprived of due process, had the right to challenge his detention where? In federal court. So federal courts do have power over even Guantanamo. Then there was another Padilla case. Now Padilla is another weird situation. This guy is actually a citizen of the United States, arrested within the United States. Is he an Al-Qaeda guy? Probably. Should he get the book thrown at him? Absolutely. Do we have to follow our Constitution? And do we have to follow the Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment against search and seizure, and the First Amendment? Apparently, we do. And also the various articles that establish that there are federal courts and federal court protection and habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means I can't just toss you in the clink. I have to charge you with something, and I have to have some evidence. So there was a Supreme Court ruling, and this was around July of '04, rules 5-4, that Mr. Padilla filed his case in the wrong jurisdiction, must refile. Then in April 2006, basically the president was pushed into a position where he had to back off and say this guy is not an enemy combatant. He is an American citizen. We have to try him in a regular court of law under our rules and constitutions, covered by the Constitution. So they avoided a Supreme Court ruling changing his status. Another guy, Shafiq Raul. Now let me say, these guys were all captured in Afghanistan. They're bad characters. They probably want to kill all of us infidels. But is there some rules? And the issue here is not anybody who says that there are rules covering these guys are cowards and cut and runners and who knows what else. It's even though we have a war, basically a world war, against a hostile ideology, do we still have separation of powers? And do the courts and the Constitution rule over decree by the president? And basically, in a nutshell, this whole thing about enemy combatants and enemy combatants not coming under the Geneva Conventions, that is entirely the executive branch making this contention. So this guy, Rasul, British citizen now. The appeals court says the federal courts have no jurisdiction. However, Supreme Court ruled in June of '04 that federal courts do have jurisdiction over Guantanamo, and that detainees must be allowed to challenge their detention in federal court. And then comes this particular one. In this particular one, the issue is, are the military tribunals correct? Military tribunals were set up by Mr. Rumsfeld and by the administration way back in November of, or actually June of 2002. In February 2002, the President declared captives as lawful combatants and not prisoner of war. In June of 2002, they said that he said the President's war powers gave him authority to detain people indefinitely and to deny them access to lawyers and to courts. And then December of 2003, the government modified its policy of denying detainees lawyers because they didn't think that that would pass muster in the Supreme Court. And let's see, by July, President Bush says he'll work with Congress to hold directly to account people to account while meeting the court's directive. Well, what is the court's directive? Court's directive is, in this Hamdan case, ruled 5-3, but of course it's really 5-4 because Roberts had to recuse himself. He had to take himself out of the running and out of the decision making because as an appeals court, he had already ruled for President Bush's position that the tribunals violate military law and the Geneva Conventions, and that the Detainee Treatment Act does not apply to pending cases. Now, what does the Geneva Convention say about the whole thing? It says that combatants, in other words, POWs really, have to be given humane treatment, and they can only be tried by regularly constituted courts. Now, there's only 2 regularly constituted courts in application over here. One is the federal courts themselves, and they can be charged with a federal crime, and certainly some of these guys have. And the other is courts-martial. But in fact, after taking a look at it, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, actually gives the defendant more rights than they have in state court. So there's a tremendous amount of rights that are given to people accused of crimes, and of course we've seen that in action, some of the Abu Ghraib trials and other things, to challenge the court, to force the court into a number 31. UCMJ 31 basically is like a grand jury, so they have to have evidence against you, and they have to present evidence against you, and they have to determine there's enough evidence against you to trial, and then you get lawyers, you get investigators, and so on and so forth. So if you're in the military, you can ask for a private lawyer, but most likely you'll be awarded a government lawyer, like a JAG lawyer. Anybody who's watched JAG, it's the Advocate Corps for the Navy, and Judge Advocate Corps, and those guys are pretty good lawyers and able to defend you, and they also have access to the government to hire investigators within the NCIS or whatever agency there is to go and do investigations on your side and to look at other alternatives and who else might have been involved and so on and so forth. So actually the military courts are actually pretty good, and they preserve rights pretty well. And of course you cannot be detained within the military under UCMJ without being charged with something. So you can't just go into an indefinite detention, which is basically what these guys are on. However, the Geneva Convention does allow indefinite detention, and those indefinite detainees are called prisoners of war. And if we had arrested them or detained them under the Geneva Conventions, we could basically keep them in a prisoner of war camp until the hostilities are over. However, they have the right to get visits from the Red Cross and so on and so forth. So they decided they didn't want to do that. That's what this Guantanamo thing is all about. And that they also wanted to, and probably for good reason, because these guys did kill 3,000 Americans, to coercively, let me put it this way, interview them and to interrogate them. So some of them did get coercive interrogations, others are just not that darn important, but are still considered important enough to be kept away from the battlefield, with the implication anybody who's an Al-Qaeda member, they let them go, they'll join the battle again. However, one of these guys, the first guy, Mr. He's not in here. I think it's Mr. Hamdi. He actually was flown to Saudi Arabia and released after being in detention for years as a dangerous enemy combatant. And then when they were forced into a position of either making a decision or charging him with something or putting him under the military tribunal, they just said, this guy's not. Thank you very much. I'm done.